5786 Monday, March 23rd. No one really knows for sure. Elu ve Elu Divrei Elohim Chaim, but this is a Missouri Levi. No one really knows for sure. Elu ve Elu Divrei Elohim Chaim, but this is the Missouri Levi. Like, trust me, that's weird shit. 3761, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, Chava. Alright, folks. Here is day 60. Bitch. This is talking about God. This is day 87 was a bitch. For instance, Kabbalah should always exist in the Kabbalah one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed late into the ages are still developed, and there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive mysticism and Kabbalah. This class may serve as an introduction to mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development. From the prophets of ancient Israel to the rise of modern Catholicism, century. Of course, the series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means. It only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully will also enable you to enjoy developing Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are as literally as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to the congregation of Tia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience around esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist featuring the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or you can find each episode after autumn of 2021 if you want to watch the entire series. You can find them on the playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I hope you check out my other content on topics of esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of three academic scholarly topics in occultism and primitive philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps a full-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate it. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. He's going to go out and steal. I don't understand. Maybe he'll just get a job. Well, we're about 5 after. I'm going to pick up with some summary from last time, so we all be on the same page of concluding the series. Great. And so that's some summary that we'll jump into it after I'll put up into a little bit more questions in case there's some lingering questions. And again, I say questions, I mean questions I can possibly answer. You ask a question like, how do I make goal? Well, sometimes I have no idea if you're a great book in Aramaic, then like, you know how to do it. So go for it, have fun. So, So as we talked last time, take a look at some really foundational texts that go over one more proto-Kabbalah. Anytime I hear the word proto-anything, it just sounds like completely pretentious academic speak. But when I hear specific texts that are going to either underwrite, you're going to see form, there's going to be some really important terminology that will come Kabbalah. But if you bridge text, you start to write Kabbalah into an earnest value, and their text says that underwrite or undergird or allow or serve as a foundation once you become a Kabbalah as you may know it, or as you may know it, and you're here to learn more about it. Madonna or whatever. Experience that's what they're as a Kabbalah. I don't think miserable help. Needs help, and not she doesn't need help. The people that are doing terrible things to her, anyways, the Sefer Yetzirah is probably one of the more famous of these books, and it's a very tiny little book. Like I said last time, and it's no more extension. It's only a couple thousand words long, and it's a book of cosmic genesis, which is just a $2 word. Like how the world came into being. We're still writing cosmos in the world, right? We've never read in recent time. I've seen all these other kinds of books like that. We're still very interested in how the world came into being. And so we get to they early describe that using different categories. The first category is the Sephirot of nothingness, right? Sephirot belly button. And as I talked about last time, we're not really sure what these are. What we do know is they're not divine in nature. We know that because the text never refers to the sun, never even sort of invokes that notion. That notion is going to come a bit later, and the full force is not for sure. And the other force is the 22 letters of the alphabet. And that is simply a story about how the world came into being with God using the 10 Sephirot of nothingness, probably mathematical terms of some kind, right? Some kind of math term, and then the 22 letters of the alphabet. Using those together, God creates creation out of nothing. And I love this image of healing. It's as if God is sort of like hammering away at nothing to form something. And this is really, I've always found this image to be very beautiful because it doesn't have this sort of God just wanted to engage. And then everything came into being. It's a kind of working class God mind building things out of nothing with numbers and letters. And I always appreciate, the working class God healing the world out of being. This is not the God speaking from on high. So I appreciate that a lot more. Have a continuity. Metaphysics are connected in a very powerful way. Echoing Rab's idea going back to the case, you'll probably consider these as a difference between the thought and the logo, the contours, the ontos and logo, the same kind of idea. By the way, the philosophy's ideas are roaring back to the 20th century, 21st century. And so, anyway, it's a pre-modern notion, but it's become both a pre-modern and a post-modern notion at the same time. The snake always swallows its tail. So, second Yetzirah has this idea about how language being relates to one another, how being is merged from language. And again, like the snake swallows its tail, right? It's also how one that thinks us, we can also, because we speak correctly, right? I can. But we can speak correctly, right? We can force reality to our magically reality we want. And of course, that's going to underwrite the entire goal of legend. And that goal of legend, of course, is all the way back to Egypt's early Talmud, where some rabbis will use Yetzirah or Sefer Yetzirah to shape into beings, whether they were a cat or a human. Now, they're not perfect, right? Because we never speak as well as God. I don't know what the dialects of Hebrew God speaks. But we never speak as well as God does. And the idea, right? This God speaks Hebrew always love the sound. They have this, they still separate between all different pharyngeal and glottal sounds. It's well lost. Both words are not Hebrew. By the way, Babylonian comments that there's a difference between and God This is what it is. But I do like the rigor of linguistic detail on the part that people with that rabbi. It's my stuff. Anyway, what we had the gold legend being into being specifically other people, other animals, of course, the remember back that lies about except that it's really right to the entire world. Right? So this is a really incredible concept. It's not just creating people, right? That's all miraculous enough. Creating the entire world. And so this is a truly tremendous idea to be found in Jewish texts. This is a person breaking into a Talmud, of course, everyone knows that this is going to defend sometime before the defeat. As a title of the homeowner, I have my position, which I think I made last time. There's a lot of debate about this. Backwater, and therefore Europe says we also should always remember that Europe is interesting places. No human being in their lifetime numbers and ages movements of much far various to each other. The fact is there in the backwater just like Europe or the Middle East. He gets out. We have some elements together in what is called Ashkenaz, that's now called Germany. And it's Ashkenaz sort of like more broad term for Germany, but certainly in Germany really do. But we have a couple of different mystical movements going on. And the two are for any type of matter for us. Therefore, it doesn't have to be a circle and what is also called the post-culture German highest classic Ashkenaz. These germ circles are very important because they're going to develop very theology in which they really give the idea of Hashemut, right? And Hashemut is the idea of which they say that God is the creator being, in the sense that there is God being and God is outside of being. Rather, you can imagine, those like really fancy weddings that have the pyramids of champagne, right, where there's like one champagne, right, on the top of it, down all the glass. Well, imagine that there's an infinite amount of champagne, God is just champagne being poured down all the glasses, right, and all of the glasses are reality. And so, whatever, or candle lighting and others, there's lots of I even heard from one of like so the idea, right, is that what you have is a creation being distinct and greater. What we have together is creator and creature are part of a continuum. They're part of a spectrum of reality where God is the most real thing. At some level, it covers all financial, right? It covers all pieces of being. That's a very different section of God's over here, and then there's creation over there. God and creation are distinct. So this idea is emerging from the cherub circle, and remember that the cherub was a kind of individual angel, a very special kind of angel, that are constantly that able to be the outer glory of God. There's an inner hidden glory of God's inner transcendence, and there's an outer glory, right? An outer glory. The cherub, right? And then that cherub indicates the outer glory of love, and that outer glory echoes out into being. And that outer glory is part of our glory. Also mentioned the South Ashkenaz, there's a lot of debate about the South Ashkenaz at this point. Earlier theory of the Jewish mysticism claimed that the entire of the Jewish mysticism in the early part of the 11th, 12th century in Germany, the Ashkenaz. I don't think Germany conjures up so many ideas because of Jewish history, and because Germany wasn't a state at that point. Germany was like a bunch of tiny little foreign states. It's like saying you're the king of Hamtramck, like that's what Germany was. Pretty much Hamtramck, it's all wedged together with a bunch of kings. I like saying Ashkenaz because Ashkenaz indicates how amorphous and barren. Right? What is Ashkenaz? It's not a general idea what we're talking about. The next thing about Germany, we're talking about around 300. So, you may know another image is also from
area around Regensburg. That's the part of Bingen. Another part of Bingen is Hasti Ashkenaz, very close proximity to where. But anyway, what's really important about them is they preserve a lot of national literature. They preserve a lot of Ashkenazi literature. They preserve a lot of Amulek literature. They preserve a lot of this strange aesthetic literature that seems to have emerged at that time. And what we now face, as scholars now think, is that rather than being a mystical movement in Judaism, it was a kind of particularly weird family who just so happened to be very, very powerful. Right? That's actually very, very powerful. You have a good bit of money and a good bit of influence. And so the Ashkenaz were famous in a way because of the relative influence they had, and because they were literate, they were connected to the Quranic family, which is a big family in Italy. And it seems like what is happening is a lot of them coming in from North Africa, from the Middle Eastern world. There's Italy, and the push of the Ashkenaz via the Quranic family. Also, to mention the Quranic family has one of the earliest examples of a possible transgender Jewish person poet. So we have a Islamist, one of the members of the Islamist family writing this poem, wishing that they were a woman, and probably expressing some, again, something like transgender identity. The poet British and the Islamist family, that got this was known for his reflections and of course, that's how I'm sure you know, one of the things that make Kabbalah very interesting is how gender exists. That God is female, male, masculine, and neither of these. And so, part of what's really Kabbalah is fascinating is the gender is going to go on. So, again, what you read that comes out of the Islamist family. Ashkenaz, we don't know. They're also different aesthetic Jewish ministry, which is that they intentionally sharp their bodies in order to get closer to God. Judaism doesn't have an aesthetic dimension so much. They're fat, they're very well constrained, not allowed to go beyond those. But there's something else out there that has lots of different potential and aesthetic practices of rolling out check out the try out take a coat off and roll out the scales your mouth is there. As we mentioned last time also, the other context is also critically important just as well as Kabbalah. It's separate by here. That's separate by here is the first time in which you have applications of the Yeshua, right? That the world is 12 is separate of Imam, separate of nothingness, and from the sharing circle over there. God, we have the idea of Kabbalah, of elimination. Those are separate by here slammed together. They're synthesized. And for the first time in the separate by here, we see the idea that God is in fact 10. That idea is the first thing. And so, in that way, the sacred by here is first public. So sometimes what happens, where should I start reading Kabbalah? I want to start reading Kabbalah's literature. Well, you don't want things to be just complicated. Start reading sacred by here. Now, does that mean it's going to be the most specific upgrade? No. Because if you've ever studied any philosopher, and this is when you're trying to forge a new idea, those texts are also most difficult because they're having to synthesize and work with ideas that are half formed.
Since Rav said his piece, again.
Those are just very half formed, and they're very like corrosive. And a classic example of this is I tell people, right? The first book of Moses was over in Parthenos. So you come there, some book of Moses. Now, there's some of those difficult books that have to say about that before. Why? Because they're missing, right? There's just a very language that I could describe things as non-physical. The most abstract, difficult things you can imagine. Still language is very complex. And so the think about here is very significant. Now, again, is it always possible to understand? No. It's pretty hard. It's pretty hard. Again, I think it's about here is perfectly approachable text slots. Gets to say about this, by here, there's certainly good important message to get into Kabbalah tonight. One,
and I love for this.
the thing about here is that pseudepigraphic
All right, let's
I
go.
like when I say pseudepigraphic. Pseudepigraphic texts are just texts that are written as if they were being written by someone else. Almost always someone more famous than the person writing it. I don't cherish them. Probably not going to write a pseudepigraphic text because Taylor Swift is saying stuff like Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift's going to sell her own books, which is magic. Well, if I write a book, I might have to do Taylor Swift. That's a probably bad idea because I'm assuming. But what I could do is attribute someone who couldn't see it. So what I would attribute to is an economic concern, right? A guy who lived 2,000 years ago in Palestine, and he has kind of general physical idea. That's exactly what the attribution or Abraham or Moses or whatever. There's a long history of doing this. And before the sacrifice here is attributed to the first century city. That's the structure that was picked up by the sacred Zohar, which we'll get next time. And that's just the king Yochai, the other second century saints. The only way you're allowed to kill someone is in what? The last thing I'll say about this up here is that the Bible is not in text.
According to the second right, son,
as you may remember, with the spirit son, the gospel world, somewhat, yeah, the late gospel world, that second, third, fourth century, since about the longer. Somewhat just survived. And the Gnostic idea is, there's a world of the base right there. Of the base, that spiritual world is good. That's out of this prison world, right? We live in a prison world with mentality, which has we see some elements of that here, and also, by the way, in the 65 years, one of the first times we get to see this wisdom being personified as divine. And that's when we shift and never have a proper, but it's also the time when the shift goes from not just being feminine gender grammar-wise, talent, to being feminine gender divine-wise, Kabbalah. But again, one of the things you'll see about beginning of Kabbalah is that often what makes Kabbalah very radical is not what the text is translated. What makes Kabbalah very radical is typically reads the text very literally, hyperly. So if Shekhinah is a feminine gender grammatical word, they say, no, it's not even grammar. So that's deep. Because the Torah never makes any mistakes. Ever. Nothing will accident. And so the word is grammatically different. That is God must have full stop. And so part of what makes Kabbalah fascinating is not that it things around, it's what it does to you. It's how literal it is. So we'll see that so far.
Well, say such a interesting
concept,
right? If anyone else is going to friends to my house, I want you to take them down. Except for Kabbalah,
still be part of Kabbalah world. But again, I think a lot of stuff will still be Kabbalah.
This might be a big question, but the authors of these texts have any idea or any speculation on who they might be?
We have a lot of speculation. Second Ezra, Dr. Weiss has, I think, the best book about Second Ezra. He claims that it's being written in what he calls terror biblical circles. That is to say, people who are adjacent to the rabbinical world but also have their need or have their toes in the philosophical world, the Christian Syriac world. You can forget right from conquest, there was a huge amount of translation of philosophical texts into Syriac by Christians in places like Syria. And that world was a booming philosophical world. And what is happening is that they're conquered by Islam, and then that took so soon when that world existed as eclipse. Those texts are rapidly translated into Arabic. And so, Dr. Weiss argues that he's convincingly look at some Samaritan literature, some Syriac literature, there are texts that look a lot like Ezra existing in those milieux. Is that true? No. maybe tell us when and where? So if someone with the medical knowledge, they write a series here in probably in contact with the medical world, but also probably having their toe in the philosophical world and the mystical world somewhere there. But the problem is that once Islam took over those areas, and once the Maya Caliphate took over, they're stating charge. They're talking about a period of maybe a couple hundred years, 100 years. So that all existed in the literary about years. It could have originated here. It could have originated here. There are people, scholars who are much better at this stuff than I am. Much more detailed, much more learned. It's arguments are made on both sides. Some people say it originated somewhere in Europe. Some people have originated or originated somewhere in Mesopotamia. I've never seen an argument that says so the Bahir is just one of these sects where no one really knows exactly where it originated. The Bahir is much more closely in the biblical circuit. It's a lot more like a biblical literature. So it's hard to say. There's one of the things where I think about poets, right? I think about poets. And, when I think about someone like Arthur Rimbaud, right? I'll give you an example. Someone tries my mind. Arthur Rimbaud. Arthur Rimbaud was a poet who existed in poetic circles in France in the 19th century, but created a poetic language no one knows of. It was basically a big version of poetic symbolism, modern poetry. And if someone had told them that would be somewhere else displeased by someone, it was a weird shit. And so it's so hard to know exactly where these things merge or develop, but super here is someone else has rights to moving. So I don't have to. I can look at mythological literature and see the arguments, but I've never seen this argument we do know where it took hold primarily. Yes, for many people that's the argument for Europe, that's what you flirt. Since here, those seems to flourish in 5 versions simultaneously all through the world. So we see versions of this, we see commentaries being written in Italy at the same time they're being written in Iran, at the same time they're being written in Egypt. And you're like, why did Paul start writing commentaries in the 10th century? What happened? Because they know they weren't working together. It sounds like the Saudi Gaon, Shaka Zanolo, and we go to Barcelona over Spain. We're all saying, hey, let's write commentary that fits together. They didn't even know it. And yet, it's something's going, there's a story. And the truth of the matter is, and also, by the way, we have to also compose sometimes called the Jewish started. There was a period after the Talmud, before the rise of Midrash, where we have experienced the but the 300-year period in which nothing seems to have been written. Right? And yet, again, sometimes some people, young scholars, want to get into the other one. They're like, yeah, what to do? I have no idea. It's going to take some Arabic. It's going to take Arabic. Hebrew, and people are going to be in these archives. In the countries like Iraq, where if there is a split in Syria, if there is a this is going to be the state archive. And lucky getting someone to do all that work. What's that? Politics. Well, that's what they teach you. That whenever somebody's like to get someone, it's clear for the church. To swipe that for the reason was, he's killing with everything else. So I said, oh, what is this called? This is called Snakes, and I'm going to get
This is what the same thing. Where it says that what's not the one
All right, folks.
so
Let's talk a little bit about what the Jewish Muslims look like just before the rise of the Kabbalah. There's a couple of social currents that are working for here. I have to tell you, right, that already by the time the Kabbalah here, Jewish mysticism is already it's already intertwined. There are already several words of Jewish mysticism was one thing by the time Kabbalah here. There's lots of currents. It's around the Jewish magic, Jewish mysticism in a broad way is already very complex about Kabbalah here. So, in many ways, it has a lot to work with. It has a huge repertoire of things to work with. Certainly, the Jewish world, once Kabbalah had already spent centuries being wrapped by what is called Maimonides. Now, I'm not going to get into everything about Maimonides country here because it's incredibly complicated. But basically, what we have is a debate about the merits of Maimonides. Maimonides, you may have forgotten, or you might not even know. Maimonides is one of the most divisive figures in the history of Judaism. Now, I know that now everybody likes Maimonides. Maimonides High School, Rambam this, Rambam that, everybody loves it. That's not the piece of Middle Ages. There were people that very for Maimonides, and there were people that were very happy to give Maimonides books as Dominicans to burn them. Jewish communities went to Dominicans and said, hey, we heard you guys burn Maimonides literature. I said, yeah, here's some. And they gave them Maimonides to burn. So, in a big way, Maimonides is an incredibly polarized case. It's very polarized because on the one hand, many people thought Maimonides rationalized every aspect of Judaism. But then, Maimonides took Judaism and just made everything into metaphors. And Maimonides did not either. They would say, okay, angels and demons is metaphor. God has hands, right? God has winds, Maimonides was happy to rationalize aspects of Judaism, way that he not conform to his version of a kind of rationalizing Aristotelian worldview. Now, there are other Jews at the time who were like, hell no. If the text says they're angels, they're angels. You are not Maimonides. You are not better than the Torah. You don't even have the Torah. The Torah means if they're angels and demons, if the Chazal, if the Talmud says they're angels and demons, it's angels and demons. And too bad, Maimonides. You can be smart enough, who knows what, and you do not get to undo this. So the Maimonidean controversy tore into Europe, especially. And this was not a small matter. And we'll get into this maybe later on, but because many people were, I'll make a long story short. If you really think that a lot of this stuff is metaphors, angels and demons and the law and all kinds of metaphors, and if God is really just an unmoved mover in the center of all void of space, making everything mechanically move around, do you really care if you pray in a church or a synagogue? You might not care. And so when they tell you, right, if you're a wealthy doctor, wealthy lawyer, court physician, wealthy poet, musician, and some guy comes along and says, you gotta convert or leave, do you leave your fancy job? Or do you go, it's all about the same. Well, that happened. And many Jews felt that Maimonides led other Jews into conversion. He assimilated them. Right? And again, think about all the things we talked about in the 20th century about how many people love to hate on assimilation. Well, this formed a reaction in the Spanish Jewish world, especially the French Jewish world, where Maimonides really got people really polarized the world, as Maimonides said. Well, one reaction to rigorous rational philosophy is a kind of romanticism. And we know that because you've seen it happen over and over and over in history of philosophy, right? Kant gave way, right? Kant, Descartes, the hyper-rationalism of people like Leibniz gave way to the romanticism of people like Goethe, right? And Schelling in the 19th century German phenomenon, 19th century German situation, right? You can't imagine the Baroque ideas of Hegel as anything other than a response to the hardcore rationalism in a certain kind of way of Kant. So romanticism is always a reaction to rationalism in some way, and we see it actually play itself out here in the 13th century. Also, what's really important is Jews at the time in Spain are living under the administration, at this time, are living under the administration of Alfonso X. Now, Alfonso X is one of these guys you probably haven't heard of, but it's actually really, really important in the history of a lot of things. Because Alfonso X was probably one of the most tolerant and curious monarchs in European history. He allowed for and encouraged translation between Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin. He encouraged poets, and artists, and mathematicians. He was probably one of the most benign, enlightened despot. In fact, if you want to think of an enlightened despot for excellence, it was Alfonso X. He was called Alfonso the Wise. And again, when also when you get these epithets right, like when you're Philip the Fair, or Philip the Bald, or Radu the Ugly, these typically are kind of accurate. And Alfonso the Wise was a pretty wise dude. And it's in his administration, Jews probably allowed the greatest amount of civil freedom until the Pope. So if you want to think about it in those terms, right, Alfonso X probably allowed Jews more freedom in his realm than any other European leader until the Pope. And so Alfonso the Wise set up a relatively liberal, again, within the confines of medieval Christendom and all things that go into that, but a relatively liberal world in which new ideas can be published, Jews can travel, and things be Also, what's important to note about this at the same time is that Jews and Christians are living in an unusually close proximity, especially in Spain and Girona, and they're talking at a level that they really haven't prior, and they really don't ever have. And they're influencing each other. Two things are really more important to mention. One is the cop-out culture, right? The cop-out heresy. The Cathars were kind of, it seems like a lay-led, semi-agrarian, dualistic movement of Christendom that lived at the very margin of Catholicism, maybe even outside of it, and they were intensely persecuted by the Catholic Church during what is called the Albigensian Crusades. People forget that the first Crusades were not Christians against Muslims, they were Christians against other Christians. The Albigensian Crusades was a crusade against anyways other Christians. Albigensian Catholics. It also is important to note about the time period. This is the time period of the rise of the Marian cults. I think Marian cult is know that I'm going to use the word cult. I'm using the religious studies term. I don't mean the word cult in a negative way. I just mean as an intense religious movement. And that is to say, there was an intense spike in Spain at this time around the image and theology and Mary adoration became intense in this time period and around the early 13th century around Mary. So there was a lot of intense veneration of Mary at this time. That's going to matter in a minute because that's going to be a marketing problem for the Jews. Because Mary is very charismatic. People really like Mary. Look at the church. They're about that Mary life, right? Marian intercession, Marian veneration proved to be enormously popular with rank and file people. Well, it's supply and demand. If the Catholics got the Mary thing, what the Jews going to get? You know the answer. Shekhinah. Right? In many ways, the Shekhinah, the feminine aspect of God, is the Jewish response to the rise of Marian veneration. Anything you can do, you can do better. You got the Mother of God, we got the Heaven of God. Right? This is a kind of theological and the development of Kabbalah. That's there on the left, you can see Alfonso X. I get the point. I collected the point because I have to have every conceivable story copy that one have. And I actually have a silver dinar of Alfonso X. You can even see his minting, that he's really picky about his minting. His minting is especially beautiful in a way that previous and after in Spanish was notorious for that. But Alfonso X really wanted to have beautiful points in it. You'll see that in his mints. And I actually don't. Alright, so what are the kind of core philosophical problems that are going to intervene in the rise of Kabbalah? Because one of the things I always like to point out to people is that mysticism and rationalism are never really opposed to history until now. It's only in the aftermath of the 18th century that we really oppose the mystical and the rational. You don't see that in the Middle Ages, you don't see that in the classical period. It's a really modern thing in many ways. So what we get, right, is an attempt solve a group of philosophical problems. And when we say philosophical, we really might say theosophical. They're philosophical problems that heavily overlap with theology. So it's not quite philosophy, it's not quite theology, it's something in between. Because there was already developed Jewish theology, and there was already developed Jewish philosophy, Maimonides, Sadical, right? And there was the traditional visions of God that had inserted in the Talmud. Well, this isn't either one of them. This is something in between, sort of cutting edge kind of thing. So the question became this. This is basically a Neoplatonic question for folks who know a bit about history of philosophy. And I say it's a Neoplatonic question because Neoplatonism is now moving into Europe via the Islamic context for the first time. And that question is this. It's a pretty basic question that is unanswerable. We have an infinite God. Because no one wants a finite God, right? You don't want a God who does stuff. It's like you ask God, hey, what's the derivative of this? God, you don't want a God who doesn't know calculus. You want a completely transcendent God that is all knowing, all powerful, all wise, all good, all there. Right? Well, this not. Everybody wants that transcendent God. And yet, we ain't transcendent. We're immanent. I don't know everything about calculus. Guaranteed. Right? I don't know everything about the Kabbalah. I don't know everything about those things. 99.999 things. I don't know anything about anything. This is a basic philosophical problem. Because this is a basic math. Infinity minus 1 is still infinity. Infinity minus 10 million is still infinity. Infinity minus 12 billion, 11 billion, whatever. You can't subtract enough, right? If you think about trying to pull the infinite toward you by subtraction, you never get to it. And if you try to get to infinity, right, by adding a little bit more, you never get the right. Because if you add to a finite number, you will never get to infinity. So how do you bridge the gap? And Neoplatonism is famous, infamous, for trying to solve this problem by adding in what they call hypotheses. Hypotheses is just a complicated word for things that are in between. They're things that are in the middle, states in the middle. And so you can see that these go from really complicated, right? Right? So this is the most simple one here on the far left. The system of Plotinus, a very famous Greek Roman philosopher in the 3rd century. And then by the time we get to the Fourth philosophy, right, it's a very small image, we see how very complicated this got. Now, right, these are just intermediaries between us and God, between the one and the simple. Now, if you look at this image, right, or this image, I bet you can already see where we're going. If you've ever seen an image of the Sephirot, tree of life, right? See how these look the same? They're starting to look similar? It's because Kabbalists are going to solve the problem in a very similar way, right? Again, we have this weird modern idea that mysticism and rationality, mysticism and philosophy can't play together. They always play together. It's a reason. And this is a great example where they play together. Now, Kabbalah wants to say have its cake and eat it too. They want to maintain that God is in fact equally transcendent. They want to maintain that. And they want to maintain that God is immanent. God is the God of the Bible that walks around full of these things in the Garden of Eden. They want to maintain God's radical transcendence and God's radical immanence. They want to have both. Because they have to have both. Because if God showed up to some guy and gave him a bunch of rules, God is immanent in this world. And also, if God is responsible for being, God must transcend being, because being can't come from being must come from something else. And so God must also be beyond being. And how Kabbalah is going to solve this is by introducing 3 concepts that anyone here who's studied any Kabbalah already has heard of. But you may not know why they're there. Right? See, they're there because they solve these philosophical problems. Now, solve them is a strong word, but in the mind of the Kabbalist, they solve them. First, this concept of Ein Sof. This is the infinite hidden God. This is the God beyond all people. Ein Sof just means infinite, right? Right? It's just the God beyond all people. This is the God that is transcendent, that is unknowable, that is beyond everything that you could ever imagine, that is beyond all that is ever in future. But you can't end there. God has to get here. How does God get here? God emanates out of that vast, infinite, beyond being, that vast nothingness, no thingness, right? God is no thing. God has to begin to enumerate. God has to begin to emanate out of God's self. And how does God emanate out of God's self? Well, God emanates out of God's self in 10 separate. And those separate are these emanations cascading out of the Godhead, out of the nothingness of the Godhead, something. And bit by bit, a ladder reaching down into the earth. And the very last rung of that ladder is God's presence. Shekhinah, feminine aspect of God, right? God pours out God's presence. And as God pours out God's presence, that in the shelter of that presence, right, is the imminent reality of God in this world. And in some sense, it is this world. That's a final outcome. This world. So the solution to this problem, the gap between the infinite and the finite, this Neoplatonic problem, Kabbalah is a very, 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 very complicated way of solving that problem. Using these three philosophical principles. And so, Sphero. Now we're going to bring this down, we'll get that story as we need, right? But my argument is that if you boil it down to the basic problem, that basic problem, the gap to the finite infinite, and the basic solution of these three things. Now, when I say basic, not basic at all, and also when we get into Kabbalah, as you see, it gets much more complicated. Let's talk about some of the early roots of Kabbalah secrets. The earliest one we can talk about, right? We need to stretch this lecture tonight. I may have to happen. We'll make what time we have, and I guess maybe next time where we leave off. The earliest school of Kabbalah that we can recognize as such is what we call the Hebrew circle, speculation circle. This circle existed somewhere either in southern Spain, although more recent scholarship was in France, although more recent scholarship was in Spain. And this group of folks seemed to have been a very small group of rabbinical elite focusing on these type of problems. For them, they also posited the idea that there's some kind of ladder gapping between infinite and the finite. And for them, however, that ladder is actually 13 separate. And what they do is they say that there are 10 separate, but the 10th separate contains 3 additional spheroids, right? So they think there are 13. Now you might be asking why 13? Well, because they're trying to solve another problem, and that other problem is that there seem to be 13 attributes of the mercy of God in the rabbinical literature, and they think that it's much more logical for there to be 13 attributes of God rather than 10, so they kind of roll the last 3 into the final one, nested in there. Now that idea of nesting emanations and emanations, right? That's going to go absolutely bonkers in a couple hundred years. When you have nested, separate, nested, separate, nested, separate, their metaphorical language really makes the circle really important is that a lot of their symbolic language, like light flames, like fragrances, right? That when you smell a beautiful rose, right, it doesn't take anything away from the rose. Now, I guess it does. You know that. Right? But the idea is that when you smell in the rose still stays the same, even though it's fragrance. And so, in some ways, you can think about that the rose needed fragrance as an image for the emanation of God in the world. In fact, this idea survives through red, deep, rose. The idea that the fragrance is given off by the flower that is God. By the way, it's simple, right? Flower and the vulva are always connected together in poetry. Or in this appearing aspect of the nature of the Godhead, where God is feminine and male at the same time, but an active force, right, but also a passive force, that humans are the ones smelling God is giving off the odor. So again, you get this idea of gender that's already been happening. The image of the overflowing fountain is very clear that they're actually looking at these fountains and imagine these cascading fountains in the Middle Ages in Spain as kind of like what God is like. Just looking at some of the fountains. I've actually gone to Spain and seen some of these medieval fountains in Castile, and they're still there from this time period. You're like, oh wow, that's what they were seeing. They thought it was separate, right? Sometimes they imagine the sun going down, and they see the sun going through the light, so through the water. And that image that was very powerful of how the universe, how the cosmos functions. They're also very interested in the symmetry of rock. They do write some commentaries involving the creation of the golem, and they're very interested philosophically in how creation began and persists. About 32 very brief works of the circle, the earliest circle of Kabbalists there, probably in Spain, survived. Although some of their works are only a page long. The most famous work they produced was called a text called the Fountain of Wisdom, and the Fountain of Wisdom goes on to be reprinted in different well beyond the survival of the circle. There's a book I'll give a reference at the end. If you want to read basically the major works that come down to us from the human circle, I'll give you a book to check out if you want to read some of their works. Many of them have been translated. Some of them. The other major group here is going to be the Provence circle. And specifically, the Provence circle being led by Isaac the Blind, who is also referred to as Simon the Whore, which in Aramaic means the one that's full of light. The idea is that while Simon the Whore couldn't see from birth, he could see from his eyes, he could see with his soul, and the fact that he's blind was not his ability, it was actually an ability, because Simon the Whore wasn't deluded like the rest of us. Simon the Whore could see the inner structure of reality, whereas we just see what's in. And the idea that Simon the Whore was not blind, he was of light. So I always like to refer to him as Simon the Whore rather than Isaac the Blind, rather focused on his ability than him as a savior. Anyway, Simon the Whore is arrived in the late part of the 12th century, and he is, so far as we can tell, the first full-time Kabbalist. He wasn't an adjunct Kabbalist. He was a full-time Kabbalist. He has a Kabbalah and Kabbalist chemistry. And we can thank him for fixing the amount of the Sephirot. He fixes it to 10. After Simon the Whore fixes the number of Sephirot to 10, he uses a verse from the Hebrew Bible from 1 Moses 11 to fix the number of Sephirot to 10 to the never change that. Simon the Whore basically sets the stage for Kabbalah in terms of eliminating the amount of Sephirot that there are. And what he argues is that these Sefirot actually something prior to our world. They're a bridge to our world. So God exists in God's utter transcendent state. The Sephirot are a kind of intermundia, they're a world between worlds. And our world is what is connected by the lack of the Sephirot to the world of transcendence. So, and this will be a debate, by the way, a lot in Kabbalah is to what degree does the Sephirot exist in our world or beyond our world, or are they a part of our world? Exist in our world? And which world may exist? Do they exist before or after creation, right? Did God say yes? Or does that inaugurate the development of the Sephirot, or does it inspire? Simon the Whore actually argues in a really dramatic, really ingenious, in other words, what he does is he proves this, that the Sephirot exist prior to our world. Simon the Whore actually goes to the Bible, to the book of Genesis, and he describes how the very first chapter of Genesis Genesis creation story do not force us to the Genesis creation story. Let's say Eli being flying, there was firmament and all this stuff. For him, that's not our world. That's the world for our world. So the Genesis creation story, the first creation story describes the world, the second two, describes the generation of the post-divine world, the world after God is really transcended, but before our world. Now, we're really looking because our world mirrors that world, and therefore the Genesis story does double duty. Right on one level, it's the story of how our world came to existence. But read on a deeper level, on a more transcendent level, it's the story of how our external world, the whole separate and so if you know how to read it correctly, or you're stuck in the horror, as a generic way, you can read into the Genesis story the greater natural coming into being of the world. And its commentary is my mind. The first commentary to the New Testament. Now, the Sacred Zohar, which we do beginning next week, spend hundreds of pages on this. So again, Saki Nahor sets the stage for what's going to become a huge unfoldment of the world of Zohar and the world of the proper. Now, as you might imagine, Saki Nahor also prohibited teaching these ideas to the public, even writing them down. He had a famous quote which he sent to some of his students over in Castile, where he said, in Rise of Provence, he said, look, if you instead of book is sealed and a cupboard is if you lock a book in a cupboard, it's not going to seal it. It's going to get out, right? And so he says, write this stuff down. Right, he knows something. Candle concealed in a cupboard. Why? Collection item. If you try to conceal a candle in a cupboard, think someone's going to see it. Well, if you try to conceal this stuff in books, it's not going to work. Why? You're not going to find the books. You're going to publish the books. You're going to copy them. And so he's the first person to actually forbid the writing down of publishing ideas. And it was for a very time successful. He's always referring to here. Right, very brief. Because as soon as it gets over the border to Spain and Girona, the brothers, the convents over in Girona, immediately began disseminating here. And what ended up happening is they further disseminated and they further write down and then began to disseminate. You see here this image of the Girona synagogue, still there in Girona. I've been there. It's very weird to walk around the old Jewish Girona knowing that Kabbalah is burned there. It feels like a wall. Kabbalah and trauma. Very good. Rabbi Rothschild, one of Saki Nahor's students, systematizes the Sephirot for the first time. And not only does he systematize the Sephirot, he systematizes some very early doctrine about the Sephirot into what is basically a Kabbalistic catechism. When I say catechism, I mean catechism. Question, answer, catechism. Again, Catholics and Jews, they kind of talk to each other. Catholics about that catechism life. Well, right, many Jews look to scholastic literature, this question and answer structure, and they copy it. And Rabbi Rothschild was the first to really systematize for the first time Kabbalah, in many ways produced the first systematic account of how Ein Sof derived separate knowledge. So it's something like an early catechism. It's a really fantastic text. Also, one of Rabbi Rothschild's students, Maimonides, you probably know as the Ramban. Right? Ramban. Maimonides is one of the most famous Bible commentators in the entire Middle Ages. And he's famous for pointing out mystical parts of the Bible in his commentary. Now, his commentary itself is overtly mystical, but he always says, right, no. He always points to this. There are instances, right, where there's a complicated cabinet. Here's the thing, here's the thing. There are these signposts and commentaries telling, right, there's a couple of things, secret. And in many ways, Nachmanides' commentary is very consistent. Commentary on the Bible goes right next to making Kabbalah more mainstream. And we're going to see this be an issue, right? Kabbalah has always had a problem. It's always been the case that it's been very alluring, but rabbis have always been skeptical of it. In Nachmanides, one of the main things he does is he legitimizes a lot of Kabbalist ideas by including them in what was taken to be one of the most definitive Bible commentaries ever. So sometimes you don't have to innovate anything, sometimes you just legitimize it. And by including it, by legitimating it, by the way, we've already seen that happen with Sefer Yetzirah, right? Sefer Yetzirah basically became part of the Jewish canon because very famous Jews like Barzillai, Shulchan and the Sadi Gaon all wrote commentaries on it. Well, if they wrote commentaries on it, must be true. Well, ditto in Nachmanides, as I've written, right, if you understand this, right, I'll Derek, right? If you understand this right, Derek Emet, according to the way of truth, then it must be some Kabbalist level. Also, Jacob Shushan is important here as well. He's basically a moralizer, right? Moralizing treaties. And those moralizing treaties go a regular way of developing a couple of schools, so we'll get into. And also, these attacks on how God is very important, right? Because one of the things Kabbalists do is maintain earlier forms of mysticism, like American Catholicism, whenever you don't result one being a business of God. And part of what Sheshe wants to do is maintain a very traditional, mystical understanding of the throne of God, as opposed to Maimonides, metaphorical, symbolic, non-literal, or rational. Last one, start to wrap up this. We know moving over to Castile, right? This is central, northern central Spain. You get the drama of the Kabbalah playing yourself out in southern France and Spain, over here now to Castile. The Castile circle really focused in on two brothers, the Cohen brothers. I know you're now thinking the Cohen brothers. Not the Cohen brothers in Castile. And they both claim to have found hidden lost books. Now, these hidden lost books that claim to have found, typically we look at that as claims in history with a lot of skepticism. But they might have been lies. We think, scholars think, they may have had access to some relatively unusual books from maybe late antiquity, maybe a little later. But there's reason to believe that some of the things they were looking at weren't completely made up out of their head. And what we get in Rabbi Jacob is a very interesting interpretation, a very esoteric interpretation of these letters. That idea of an esoteric interpretation of these letters is always here. We get another version of it here in Rabbi Jacob. And in Rabbi Isaac, we get perhaps one of the most shocking books, I think, top 3 shocking books ever read in Judaism. This is a book called The Treatise of the Emanation of the Left-Hand Side. And what Rabbi Isaac argues is that flowing down the left-hand side of the emanation structure of the divine is evil. That evil is a quintessential aspect of the development of God. That these sufferers have an inherently evil concept that could not have been, right? Now, this is very important because traditionally in Judaism and in Christianity and in Islam, evil has typically been imagined as privation. It's like cold deprivation of heat, like darkness deprivation of light. Many theologians argue that darkness, evil doesn't exist on its own. The Cohen brothers, similarly in the tractate on the treatise on the emanation left-hand side, argues no, evil is part and parcel of the structure of reality. You could not say otherwise. And further, God did try to constrain it, and it didn't work. God tried to constrain it 3 different times. Every time, reared back to the horrifying reality. And the third time, what ends up happening is there's an entire alternate separate system on the backside of the separate system that's evil. So imagine the divine system, right? With like all the little dots of the separate. Well, imagine they have an inverse version. That inverse version is evil, right? Now the first 3 are destroyed. God destroys them, but the rest remain. And the last 7 that remain are demonic forces that still fall out of reality. And those demonic forces are part and parcel of the necessary structure of reality. So this is where evil is actually primordial. Evil existed before creation itself, and it will be here until creation is destroyed. This idea, right, the idea that evil is primeval, seems to really been influential in the development of the earth and Kabbalah, and the idea that evil is fundamental to reality is going to go directly to the heart. So what's going to happen is this evil is going to be here until the Messiah comes, and it's going to transform the urge for that. So insofar as it is a reality, that reality is penetrated, inherently logical. Now, the idea, right, is that we can resist that evil by doing the mitzvot. This idea comes from the true examination of inside says when you do the law of God, when you follow the Torah, you're not just following the rules of God, what you're actually doing is metaphysical warfare against it. So when you observe Sabbath, when you lay to felony, when you get money to the poor, you're not just doing a mitzvah. You're engaged in a continuous battle with good versus evil, where goodness pushes back against the demonic forces of evil. By pushing back the demonic forces of evil, creates a kind of gap, and into that gap inside. And so the idea is that the Talmud is also very clear about this. The Messiah only comes in 2 circumstances. When a generation deserves it because of their righteous deeds, or when the world is so evil, only the Messiah does this. And so the idea here is you must do the work of the gap through righteousness in the forces of evil, so that Messiah can come through wipe our lives. So the trees of elimination of left inside, and we're going to see someone get into the Zohar next week, is decisively important in the development of the Kabbalistic tradition, which is not anything like Maimonides, it's nothing like St. Augustine, it's nothing like the proponents of Al-Ashari, Islamic tradition. This is a rigorous idea. Source is real, it's part of reality, it must be actively resisted. Again, it's a huge relation to see also their right? You can see the art of simulation, right? Where here we're seeing the art of crucifixion, right? You can see that around the time of the early Middle Ages, Jesus is hanging on the cross and very serene. So by the high Middle Ages, he's floating, serene, he's standing almost in a Y shape, his body is frail, broken. Huge conceptions in the 13th century in Spain. You can see those ideas into Jewish it's in this circumstance, folks, so we start to wrap up this evening with this question. So we're a little bit longer this time. It's in this circumstance that we need most of it. Right? In Castile, in the middle of the 13th century, it is around Moshe Leon, that both cultures were so hard. And if you know anything about Zohar, anything about Kabbalah, this is the central text of Jewish mysticism, the Sefer Zohar. And I will say, in many ways, it's the last text to gain universal recognition by all of the world's Jews as scripture. And that's once and all for Sefer Zohar, the book of the Zohar, is the last text of universal recognition from Jews in Yemen, Spain, Jews in Northern Europe, Jews in North Africa, Jews in North America, South America, Jews in Ukraine. All of those accepted, came to accept the authority of the Sefer Zohar, and it is the last Jewish scripture to become a scripture in the U.S. The only Jew who really rejected it were 19th century Reformers. And it is the last Jewish scripture to become a scripture in the U.S. The only Jew who really rejected it were 19th century Reformers. They rejected it. Right? So they decanonized it. Prior to that, there was no Jewish group, no Jewish community that didn't think that someone was a piece of scripture. I argue we got to reclaim that scripture. Liberal Jews, right? We got to reclaim that. I think it's one of the most amazing values ever. It's amazing. We should reclaim it. And we should reclaim it because of what the others have shown. We should reclaim it because of what it does. It's one of the texts in many ways. We should do it for what it does to all communities. We should reclaim it because it's ours. But it should not be the unification of the surrounding world that claim it's there. It's so hard to reclaim. It's part of our success too. And so, get to it started. Just some text here on early Kabbalah. Just dawned on early Kabbalah. I will say it's pound single best Kabbalah. Early Kabbalah. The early Kabbalah is pretty applied. He covers a lot of the stuff. The humanation, the truth of humanation, what's inside, also in the early Kabbalah. Also, there's really great book he has in the Cherub Circle. The guy that invented Salah, humanation. He has a whole book on them. Really fascinating. You want to get ILL now, it's really expensive. If you want to read about the Union Circle, the group of Kabbalists, Vernon has a really great book on them. The entire text of the Sefer here is reproduced by Kaplan, although I will say that my caveat with Kaplan is that Kaplan is by saying that glory and Kabbalist, glory and Kabbalah weeks. And he kind of reads back to the literature of Sefer Yetzirah by here. Later, we're going to distort it a little bit, but still a good text, still a good translation, nonetheless. And we're going to reproduce the church. All right, next week, folks, we get to the big one. We're going to spend an entire session on this. I could do an entire class easily do an entire class. For the rest of my life. I'm going to do an entire class on it. I'm doing my very best to get you oriented to it so that you can feel confident to at least get into some of the sections. Because it is an intimidating text. I'll admit, it's the single most intimidating text I know of. Like when I play it, like Hegel, Fisher-Price, compared to right? Like just phenomenal of spirit, it's like training. So that's it, folks. So far, next week. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me as I explore the garden.
You're fine. Go fuck yourself.